In a logging camp in 1904, there resided a small group of hardy logging men. The men were ordinary. They were of low-income upbringing, either driven to logging by their family DNA, fathers and grandfathers, logging or pushed towards the vocation, due to the growth in logging in the northern Canadian region, and its reward of decent wages that would mostly be sent home to their various wives and children and parents. The camps were populated by hard workers, but also those that did not immerse well into general society. Primarily, the Yukon was occupied by various Athabascan tribes. In the north, in basins of Peel River and Porcupine River, there lived the Kutchin, or as they called themselves, Gwitchin. A certainty, of course with very little deniability, was that this was their land. In the late 1800s and turn of the century, the new immigrant inhabitants of the new nation of Canada decided that it was their God-given right to self-provision the land to exploit the natural wealth as they saw fit, and logging, fishing, hunting for meats and pelts were, in addition to general agriculture, were theirs to take, and with little resistance. Much of the local meat sources were hunted down to near extinction to ensure the dependence on the white man's sources and distribution. Of course, the indigenous of the region, including the aforementioned tribes, and in addition to the Inuit, were either provided some concessions that were far worth more in acceptance than the trouble experienced should they not accept. Of course, they were also provided some menial roles in the camps as cutters and cleaners. These jobs were soon sought after as they provided income and a connection to the new inhabitants that could possibly mean better employment, growth, and influence in this new world. Most, however, repudiated the land use by the new immigrants. Some were vocal, others were violent and were swiftly dealt with by the white men. Oftentimes, humiliated in violence in front of their kin to teach a lesson. One such tale of resistance was Amaruk. Amaruk represented a different situation. He was an Inuit boy in his late teens that was stolen away with more of his people by fishermen, taken from their home to sell to logging camps as workers and carried by boat until an overland journey was necessary, and then by horse and travois. They were taken hundreds of miles from their villages in the north. Amaruk, along with 5 others, were purchased by the Yukon logging camp just outside of Whitehorse. There was no path home from there. There was no road that led to the glaciers of the Beaufort Sea. Amaruk was placed in a cabin on the outside perimeter of the camp with the other captured. James Mulligan, the camp captain, would have one of his Inuit cutters speak to them in their language of familiarity to explain that they would have a good life here as long as they worked hard and didn't cause trouble. Of course, there would be immediate resistance from Amaruk and his accompanying hostages. Amaruk had no hope of his rescue. He could run, but he would never see his family again. A tracker he may have been, but not this far inland. Amaruk was put to work immediately. He was placed with the loggers and made to rope up the ends of the logs for transporting with the high-wheel logging machines. He was given no clothes, and his furs were far too valuable for him to keep. One of the white men, Albert, took some pity on Amaruk and his fellow Inuit. Just enough to ensure that they were well trained and fed well enough, but not enough to risk his stature with the team. Albert's empathy for the indigenous and his dislike for their brutish treatment didn't go unnoticed, and during a night of drinks, he was beaten to death, in a fair fight situation as it was explained to the camp leader. Albert was trouble, and the lads of the camp had no rejection to violence for troublemakers. One afternoon before close of a working day, the sun was long past the horizon, and torches kept alight the workspace. Amaruk was fatigued and hungry, and gestured enough in motion towards his boss Leonard Smallwood if he could finish for the day. Amaruk, like the others, were fed half the portions of the other loggers and worked longer hours, usually meant to finish up moving the logs while the rest left for the camp to rest for the evening. Oftentimes required to walk back themselves, with no horse wagon transport. This particular evening, Leonard told him to wait with clear hand-gestured instruction. and with a hateful expression on his face, while he and a couple of other men tied up the last log, hooked it up to the chain. However, as Leonard did, Amaruk noticed that the chain had slipped near the end. Leonard clearly and lazily had not chained it tight enough, and it had slipped loose off the chain. Amaruk screamed, and the rest of the team, alerted by the scream, watched as the chain slipped loose and the log rolled down the side of a steep hill and into one of the loggers at full speed. Jack McKinney was killed almost instantly, as this 1-ton log flattened what could be flattened and pulverized the rest. Jack had no time to react. The blood was spread across the men nearby, and his innards were spread across the ground. The crunching of bone made Amaruk wince and feel sick. He dropped to his knees, shocked and saddened, but mostly nauseous. The team rushed in, and when the captain heard the racket, he pushed to the front to see old Jack, bloodied and crushed to a pulp. He took off his hat out of respect and laid it on his chest and demanded to know what happened. The logging team on the scene, led by Leonard, scanned the crowd through their gritted teeth and enraged eyes, pointed at Amaruk, and swore that Amaruk had protested all day about having to work and that he wanted to leave early, and when they wouldn't allow him, he purposely loosened the chain that eventually caused the death of old Jack McKinney. Amaruk understood nothing that was said, but it was clear in their faces and physical accusations that he was being accused for this horrific death. He screamed in protest, shaking his head, and begged Mulligan to listen to him, that he was not the cause of this. Then, all went black for Amaruk, as he was clubbed over the back of the head by a very willing Leonard Smallwood, and knocked unconscious, and dragged into camp by horse. Amaruk, amid screams from his own kinfolk in their native language, was dragged into one of the cabins and chained up. He awoke a couple of hours afterwards, hungrier and colder than before. He couldn't move. Only then did he realize that he had been restrained to a load-bearing 4x8 in the center of a dark cabin. He was confined, and he knew why, although he felt helpless that anyone would ever believe him. He couldn't communicate with them, and who would ever speak on his behalf anyway? He shuffled around in the chains, trying to wiggle free. He was wrapped to that upright quite tightly. Then the door opened. It was James Mulligan, the leader of the camp, the boss. He sat across from Amaruk and then spoke to him in clearly accusatory and angry terms that Amaruk didn't comprehend. It was an indictment. In this camp, as suspected across all camps of the land, a white man would have been punished and sent back to his work, or fired and shipped out. Amaruk and his people were, to these men, cattle. They were not only utterly inhuman, but when they became a liability, as they now saw him, he was only worth the swinging of a rope and nothing more. This was his sentence. He was charged by only a flurry of finger-pointing, but his judge, jury, and executioner was James Mulligan, not an ethical man by any standards. In the darkness and isolation of these dark woods, Amaruk would be hung up until dead. Leonard and his few other men that knew the truth would be free to shout at the murderer from the safety of their presumed innocence. What was one more Eskimo bastard swinging from a rope, they thought. The following morning the deed would be done, and Amaruk would be carried by his kin into the forest and left for the wolves to finish. When Amaruk was certain of his fate, explained in as many physical genuflections in a most grim manner, nearly laughable to the white men, explaining that he would be executed the following morning, he kept silent and stoic. He didn't want to be there in the first place, and now the victim of injustice with the harshest sentence possible. These men were wicked. He would not give them the pleasure of being afraid or begging for his life. He was too proud. Death was only one phase of life for his people, not like these enslavers. They were evil and immoral in his mind. as perverse and black-hearted as any men alive. When he was left alone, no food wasted on him, tired, cold, and fatigued, he chanted. Amaruk no longer felt pity for himself, for his fate. He only then felt hatred, loathing, and begging for vengeance. He prayed to the Tariaksuq. The Tariaksuq were demons. They were the boogeymen of the ice region, feared above any other, called upon with promise of souls to swiftly expedite the lives of those asked to take. Never allies to his people, but a powerful force of evil that roamed the northern lands, glacier, Arctic, and terrorized its people. They were never mentioned, forbidden to discuss or even name. The Tariaksuq were ancient legends. They were also known as the Shadow People. They inhabited a shadow land, and they are almost never seen. But when conditions are right, the Tariaksuq can be heard at night, in the distance, across the ice floes and beyond the forest near the frozen world. Amaruk's father had once sworn to his fellow fishermen he was once witness to one of these red-eyed demons, while out catching fish too late in the evening once, and while packing up the sled. He saw one staring from the tree line, eyes red and ablaze, glowing against the backdrop of the darkness. A beast that must have been called upon, as they do not appear unless they are called upon, and even when they are, it is rare that they will show. It is known that their presence is only from the desperation of the soul's need. Amaruk's father had jumped onto his sled and whipped and begged the dogs to fly. The Tariaksuq were not to be trusted by the invited. However, Amaruk felt such a loathing sense of revenge that he prayed, and prayed hard. He prayed without letting up, chanting all evening. He had the other loggers banging on the cabin for him to shut up, which only made him chant louder and louder to the sky, begging the Tariaksuq to come in swarms and take revenge on these white devils. Then, in a sweating, feverish convulsion, Amaruk stopped immediately as he heard a slight whoosh of breath behind his ear, like an animal's pushed breath into the cold. Unable to turn and unwilling to do so, he closed his eyes. The thing, whatever it was, rattled and pulled away into the darkness. The low breathing faded into nothing. He smiled quietly and said, "Nakur Mick," to his demonic guest, and passed out. He awoke the next morning with a slap across his face, followed by a bucket of ice-cold water. He yelped in pain. It was morning. He suddenly was made conscious of what this meant. He was dragged across the logging field where a man held up a book and gestured to Amaruk in a seemingly spiritual ceremony. He saw Leonard Smallwood in the crowd and glared at him, swearing in Inuit feverishly. Then, he was placed on a horse with a rope fastened around his neck. He closed his eyes and spoke a prayer in his language, while the demons that were punishing him for nothing said their own insincere prayers. Then, in his last utterance, he screamed aloud to the Tariaksuq. It stunned the other Inuit that watched. The other loggers just laughed. A slap on the horse and Amaruk slipped off, and a sharp snap was heard, even sickening the hard men around, followed by cheers from the brutes, and Amaruk swayed, eyes wide open to the sky, then twitched slightly and was pronounced dead, cut down, placed on a travois, covered with deerskin. He was then unceremoniously dragged by the travois a few miles into the forest by his fellow Inuit, a couple of Cree, and one camp manager, where he was meant to be left out for the wolves. His brethren were his transporters, so lying him on the ground, they recited their own words for the delivery of his soul to his ancestors. You see, the Inuit sacred practices included animism and shamanism, in which spiritual healers mediate with spirits. Amaruk was no healer, but powerful of soul, and felt a strong connection to the spirits before his death. Helpful spirits can be called upon in times of need, yet some are evil, monstrous, and responsible for bad hunts and broken tools. They were the boogeymen of ancient Inuit culture. They were the stories to keep children awake and shivering. They have been witnessed in certain conditions. Like Amaruk's father and others, some have testified. It was legend, but when ships from Britain were locked in the Northwest Passages and killed the seals and polar bears, the lifeblood of the Inuit, they were set upon by the Tariaksuq. The demons ravaged their remaining crew, and any left alive were paralyzed with fear. This was a story passed down for 5 or more decades from the Arctic peoples from village to village. The ships remain, it is said, wrecked upon the land still. It was never wise to summon the Tariaksuq. It was warned to never speak their name or entice them. Amaruk's loathing and desperation, regardless of consequence, took him over, and the Inuit and other natives in the camp began to feel the approaching presence of these spirits. It got stronger each day, and they were in tremendous fear. Some refused to work due to chills and nausea. 2 attempted to escape and were caught and beaten. One of Amaruk's friends took his own life. He knew what was coming. He knew that when they arrived, there would be no respite, regardless of spoken tongue or skin color. Amaruk selfishly had unlocked the gates of hell, and there was no closing of them until it was over. It was nearly 3 weeks later, after the violent dispatch of Amaruk, that the dread began. Denis Laporte, a young cook in the camp, was sweeping up the kitchen when he heard voices, mixed into the howl of the wind. He heard the pitch of the northern breeze that flows through the trees like a breath through a wind instrument. It sometimes portrayed a voice, but it was familiar, and they were aware that it was just a trick of nature. This, however, was not. This was clear chanting. Many voices chanting in a terrible tone. Low droning of words that he didn't understand. He ran out of the mess tent and towards his accommodation to sense-check himself with his cabin mates. He stopped dead outside of the cabin. He was breathless, heart beating fast. Staring into the tree line of blackness was the silhouette of a half-dozen dark figures. Unmistakable red glowing eyes. The chanting was coming from these things. He thought for a second that they were some of the locals dressed in ceremonial costumes. They had antlers and long, thin arms, long legs at least 7 feet tall each. This height brought the immediate understanding that these were not any residents of the camp that he knew of. They didn't move. They did, however, began to emit a shriek that was enough to immediately wake the rest of the camp. Shouting and swearing ensued, and young Denis ran off, watching that he was not being followed. He rushed into his cabin, slamming the door behind him. The rest were already awake, as the rest of the camp were. It was approximately 10 p.m., and the mornings being very early, most slept by 9 p.m. except the cooks and the cleaners such as Denis. He shouted to them that there were people in the camp. He told them that they were dressed up as animals, and he was not sure if they were human. They had horns. He pleaded for them to believe. The rest were confused enough by the shriek a moment ago that had woken them, but not confused enough to believe this rubbish spewed by an overworked teenager.
"I'll show you,"
he said, pointing outside. They decided to entertain the hysterical boy and dressed quickly and followed him outside. Denis was clearly reluctant to exit the cabin, but felt safe with the other 3. A screeching wind immediately carried across them. bringing the same shriek from all directions. Then, Denny saw the horned demons flying towards them, on foot, moving faster than anything he knew, eyes glowing. His cabin mates all screamed. Denny closed his eyes as he felt the things moving past him. Air compressed, and his body tightened. He physically felt them move through him, and felt a tremendous pain. He opened his eyes and turned. His head was in tremendous pain as he turned to see his friends lying on the ground, disemboweled and headless. Denny was lightheaded and in pain and now in complete shock at the sight of his friends ripped apart and reduced to a pile of flesh on the pine needle-covered dirt. He gasped, but was unable to breathe. He looked down in time to see his intestines pour out of his gut and felt blood gushing from his neck as he lost consciousness, fell to the ground, into his own guts, while his head came away. Then, a tremendous screech flooded the woods, fields, lake, and camp. Men poured out of all of the cabins confused and shouting to one another. Holding shotguns, axes, and logging pikes, they poured into the camp's center. They were confused to the sound that they hadn't heard anything like before. When they got the scream to come to the scene of the evisceration, they were overwhelmed, most puking, others weeping from disbelief. Mulligan needed to be tough and told them to pull it together. The indentured help, the First Nation people, were wisely locked into their cabins. They knew better. It was immediately blamed on the group of Inuit that were instantly rounded up and accused of being so enraged at the execution of one of their people. The white men were inflamed and bloodthirsty beyond any sense. They saw 4 of their men, their co-workers, their brothers, laying in heaps on the ground, and that was enough to drag out Mick, Tariaksuq, Panuk, and Ikiak to the front of the scene. Their hair was gripped and forced to view the mounds of ripped flesh on the ground. Mulligan, in teary rage, asked them who it was that committed such a foul act to the 4 men that were better than these dogs that he had rounded up. He screamed in rage at them repeatedly, winding himself up in the spirit of rage, not receiving any answers. Nor could they have provided any even if they spoke the language. Mulligan peered at the mess of blood and guts that was his team, fellow white men, and then back to spit screaming in the faces of the Inuit.
Who did it? Who did this?
His rage reached its climax when he took a logging pike and buried it swiftly into the head of Tariaksuq. With a furious scream and a cracking thud. This shook everyone watching. Mick, Panuk, and Ikiak fell to the ground screaming in their language. Leonard, the sole architect of the chaos and misery now inhabiting the camp, shouted to Mulligan to finish off the rest just to be sure. The Inuit knew who Leonard was, and knew from Amaruk what he had done, and when he piped up, he drew menacing glares from the tear-soaked eyes of the 3. Their fury and indignation was palpable, almost terrifying. Mulligan demanded that the bodies be burned and that the remaining 3 would be placed in the shed and locked up until he decides what will be done with them. They were being led away, and Ikiak pulled away and stood facing Mulligan, and with a deeply sought defiant energy, he said, "Tariaksuq," and then scanned the rest of the men and repeated in an almost whisper, "Tariaksuq," and then was grabbed and shoved towards the shed. Ikiak provided the rest of the men with a warning that they would never have understood, a foreshadowing of their complete demise, and they will never have known what was to come until it was too late. They were locked in a dark, cold shed on the outside of the camp, near the outhouse, left to listen to the woods around them and pray for a quick painless end, if it should come to them. Morning arrived, and the smell of food wafted through the camp and into the dingy shed where a starving trio sat, barely conscious from the cold and hunger. The camp went about their business, and each passerby near the constructed jail cell shed gave it a loud kick or strike with whatever they were carrying. There was no chance that the anger would cease and they would be freed. This was obvious. They knew somehow that they would not be murdered because there was no evidence of their guilt, unlike the false witnesses to Amaruk's charge. Also, Mulligan acted out of passion when he murdered their brethren, and that seemed like a sweeping penance. This did not mean that they would ever resume to any normality in the camp. The only obvious outcome was more time in the shed, and then perhaps menial, filthy tasks in place of their usual remits. This was all assumed, but turned out to be fairly accurate. Many, like Leonard and his little gang, wanted them dead, publicly if possible. He hated the filthy Eskimo shit, he called them. Leonard, you see, was not a man with a love for cultures outside of his white race. There were many that began slow conditioning through Leonard and his cancerous vitriol. Leonard's words gained steam, and soon half of the camp poured poison into the ears of Mulligan to have them executed. Because if he hadn't, they would rise up during their sleep, eventually, and slaughter them all like the savages they were. Like they did to Denny, Connor, Mick, and Sean. Mulligan, shockingly, maintained a clear head, and he decided to leave them to be sat in their box and wait until a decision is made on their future. They would receive the scrap leftovers from meals, usually covered in saliva, as many of the men knew where the scraps were going. This night was coming fast. The days were becoming shorter and colder. The three Inuit had decided that they were going to die in this small wooden shed, locked up, freezing, fatigued, delirious, and hungry. Their time was soon to come. In a decision of rash judgment, the three decided that, for Amaruk, and for Taktu, and for them and for their people, that they have pillaged and decimated across their lands, they would simultaneously summon the Tariaksuq. If they were to die, they would be prepared anyway. If they were denied into the Shadowlands to be with their ancestors, they had decided that this was worth the price. So this evening, the chanting began. Deep meditation prayer to negotiate the return of the Tariaksuq, to sow revenge. Bloody revenge on these wicked, vile loggers. They, cumulatively, prayed for the complete destruction of the white man. They chanted long into the evening, deep into the night, constantly surrounding their concentration. Howls and wails deep in the forest, the sound of trees breaking and collapsing. This time, it felt as if there were no small scout party of Tariaksuq, but they have unleashed the predatory ecstasy of the Tariaksuq, salivating for blood and death. These creatures of leathery skin, elongated antlers, jagged teeth-pointed claws, fur-lined backs, and towering height of nearly 8 feet, dashing at blurred speed, lusting for carnage, were now beckoned and would arrive from the Shadowlands most rapturously and with boundless malice. The Tariaksuq, as you know now, could cut a man to ribbons within a fragment of a second. There were stories, however, of a preference to take their time, if the situation was right, and ensure that it was agonizing, and that the victim left this world paralyzed with fear. Their presence was felt, and the feat that the three Inuit would normally possess throughout the entire evening was exchanged for a satisfying sense of impending vengeance. They were undoubtedly close now, arriving from the netherworld, and it was a matter of time, for the death would, hopefully, be swift and preferable to the hell they currently inhabited or could ever hope to exist in. They had sacrificed themselves, they had no doubt. It was what was needed to secure the screams and terror from their enemies, murderers of their people, persecutors that would never stop. They closed their eyes and continued to chant. The sun was peaking above the horizon, and they collapsed from fatigue. At least 12 hours of meditative chanting, and it nearly killed them. They passed out from delirium, cold, hunger, and exhaustion. They dreamt of a bad wind floating through the trees, across the lakes, meadows, rocky outcrops, and ice flows, howling, and then taking shape with great majestic antlers and bodies of giant hairy beasts, red eyes and terrible. These dreams lasted until the three did not dream any longer, nor did they awake. The tremendous energy took its toll, and the three Inuit men left this world on their own terms, but not without a parting gift for the lecherous, petty men that brought them and murdered their kin and extracted their souls. Davy Carmichael, the oldest of the loggers at 58, had used his one day off to leave the camp for some fishing. There were notable rivers nearby that carried rainbow trout, a favorite of the men. He packed up his day's equipment, including a roughshod fishing rod left to him by a departed fellow logger, and his bait, and made the 10-kilometer hike to the camp's favorite stream. He expected a haul of 20 or more trout to bring back to the camp. Davy wanted no part of the treatment of the Aboriginal men. However, he felt that staying quiet was best. He was too old to engage in internal conflict, and although he felt the treatment was harsh, he walked away from the chaos when it happened those 2 evenings ago. Davy reached his prime fishing spot, set up on a grassy hill, and began casting out onto the deep stream. No better way to spend a day off. The day was cold, as Septembers often become in the Yukon. Also a great time for fishing. After a few hours and a dozen fish, Davy tucked into a beef sandwich he had brought from the leftovers the evening before, along with an apple, washed down with a pint of cold milk. He had set the rod down, washed the fish guts off his hands in the stream for handling his sandwich, and stared out across the stream and forest across from him in a daze. Davy noticed a movement in the water, a splash in his peripheral vision. He smiled, knowing the fish were still biting, and attempted to hurriedly finish up his sandwich so that he could get back into it again. Again, another ripple in the water on the other side. And something appeared in the water. A stick, it seemed to him, floating but upright, getting taller in the water. This branch or stick. Suddenly it was clear that this was part of an antler, and felt that an elk or caribou had been dead in the water, and it was just resurfacing. It was soon not the case. A head, attached to these moss-covered antlers, emerged. This was no deer or elk or caribou. Davy seized up in fear as he saw bright red glowing eyes fixated on him from this surfacing creature. It walked through the water towards him. It was massive, and when it roared, Davy dropped his lunch and fled as fast as his old legs could take him. He turned when he was in the woods, but saw nothing. Then heard the roars surrounding him. He kept running, not entirely sure what direction he was running in. He was lost, but when he stopped to catch his breath, he continued to listen and scan his surroundings. Shaking, he pulled out his knife from its holster and held it out.
What is it? Who's there? What are you? Is this a joke?
He yelled. A fierce shriek followed from multiple directions around him. He walked slowly in the same direction he had been running. He heard branches snapping, trees being brushed against. He tiptoed across the forest floor. This continued for another hour as he moved forward. Sounds from behind him and then, occasionally ahead of him, in the distance. He then heard a growl from nearby and dropped down next to a fallen log and cowered, shaking. Maybe it was a forest animal, just a wolf or a bear stalking him. It didn't sound like either of those. And unless it was his imagination, the thing in the water was no bear or wolf. Something supernatural, he was sure. He immediately thought of Denny and his cabin mates, sliced up and left a mess of flesh in that camp. Davy heard, very distantly, the sound of logging machines. He felt some relief and began running in their direction. He was barely permitted to stand from his hiding spot when he was seized upon by a colossal, hairy beast with glowing red eyes. It had grabbed Davy's head with its massive claws and raised him up, eye level with the thing, with the bright orange dusk sun behind its head. Davy could only see a vague outline, and hot breath released into the cold air as it pressed its claws into Davy's head, crushing his skull and releasing his gelatinous eyeballs to stream down his face. He hadn't even had the chance to utter a sound other than a sharp exhale. As his head was pulled off, Davy's old body had returned to the moss-covered floor of the forest. Then, a monstrous shriek was sent across the landscape, causing the camp to hold firm, causing a cumulative pounding of hearts, especially those indigenous that were still indentured in the camp. They knew what the Inuit had released. They knew that they were as doomed as the rest. There would be no reprieve or mercy for any living thing this day. They also knew it was here now. It was close. As the darkness reached the camp, and Davy's friends were well aware that he was not the type to not be aware of being back before dark, they knew something was terribly wrong. Fires were set up around the perimeter of the camp. Guards were set up in case a pack of wolves had gotten the courage to sniff around. Bears, especially the black bears of the region, were notorious for sitting quietly and covertly like spies in the deep wood and taking their chances when they could. 4 bonfires with 4 sets of men patrolled the area around the camp, each being a solid 200 meters apart from one another in this large logging camp. They had rifles at the ready. James Mulligan sat in his cabin having a late dinner, the bear skin stolen from the deceased Amaruk around his shoulders, cursing its unfamiliar stink, yet relishing its warmth. The foreman, Mulligan, had given away the possessions of the Inuit to the captains of the camp where they could be used, skins and hand-carved items. The winds howled outside his cabin. Then, a low, deep, long panting to his left. He turned his head. He froze in terror when he saw the Tariaksuq stand high in his window. Piercing eyes burned into Mulligan with a loathing. Mulligan's breath caught in his chest as he yelled for help. He fumbled for the revolver on his desk sitting across the room. Before he could reach it, the beast smashed through the window, taking at the lower part of the wall and grabbed Mulligan, without any additional terrorizing scream from the creature. It opened its maw and clamped down over Mulligan's head, taking his neck and part of his chest off in one ravenous bite. Blood spread across the cabin. The animal swallowed and then raised its grotesque deer skull head, touching the ceiling of the cabin with its antlers and screeching for partial vengeance taken, and a warning that it and its fellow demons were now seeking out the remaining souls of the camp. Shots were fired from all sides of the camp. The unseen and quick Tariaksuq flew from shadow to shadow, ripping apart man after man until they left over a dozen bodies lying across the camp. Then, gone. The horses and dogs that didn't run were also destroyed. The men remained vigilant, and when they felt that the carnage had ended, they took care of their dead. One of the dead, Leonard Smallwood, was particularly savaged. His head had been ripped off and placed on a group of branches, while his body was flayed open, butterflied, and spread across the roof of his cabin, blood dripping down into and around the lodge. The camp was now shut down. There was no more work to be done. The company was now taken charge of by Ernie Bell from Vancouver. He had ordered all to pack whatever they had and be ready to march out and make their way to Whitehorse, which was a 2-day walk, and since their horses were now gone, they could carry very little and start out first thing in the morning. There were 26 men left. A few indigenous workers were made to carry the bulk of the supplies, and until morning, they were also made to keep watch while the rest slept. Sounds permeated the area around the camp all night. The sense was that these things were not gone. They were waiting. They were watching, stalking, and for some reason they didn't attack. Morning came. The moment that the sun was up, the dinner bell reserved for the mess hall dinner notice was used to wake the camp. They were ready, packed, and needed to walk, all of them, into the brush, through the trails, to make their way to Whitehorse. Through the thick trees, on a winding rocky path, the trip would be long and tiring. It was much colder this morning. They dressed as warmly as they could and in groups with rifles at the ready. They cautiously made their way along the trail, leaving behind the camp, the cabins, much of their belongings, valuable equipment, and many dead bodies. What couldn't be left behind were the vivid memories of the terror that occurred, and the terror that they sincerely wished was behind them for good. The sounds of nature, birds, deer, insects surrounded them, and this was a warmly received respite from the alternative. They stopped to set up their tents in a clearing near a riverbank upon the first sign of sunset. They made the remaining indigenous fetch fresh water and firewood. Once dark, they set up the fire and roasted deer meat, corn, and potatoes, and with sips of whiskey to warm them, they were unusually quiet. It seemed very wrong to laugh and shout, as the good spirits were now over, after what had hunted and attacked them just one night before. What was probably not finished with them yet. They stayed quiet, always listening, intently surveying the darkness. Men on guard around the camp, others patrolling close by. Ernie, the proxy leader, had convinced them that they were now safe and that it would only be a day or two, and they would be safe back in Whitehorse, and they would get reinforcements from the army, if they believed them, and to come back to avenge their mates. Ernie knew that this would never happen. If they were to say anything, the massacre would be placed at their feet, and they didn't want to hang for these murders. Nobody would ever believe them. Night was cold, and all turned in, leaving just 2 men to keep watch outside, sitting on chairs with their rifles near the burning embers of their campfire. Colin MacArthur ended up sleeping in his chair, and the other, Gordon MacDonald, the camp handyman, was a bit more brazen and stupidly more courageous than the others and cared nothing for this guard duty, or for keeping anyone safe for that matter. A fat, disgusting man. He was a bully and a glutton, often taking food that was not his. He believed that it was the other natives that invaded the camp and killed his fellow loggers. He always blamed the Aboriginals for anything that went wrong at the camp. Gordon liked to fight. He was nicknamed Scrapper by his co-workers for his desire to pick fights with the smaller lads and beat up on the natives when he knew he had an audience. And if they wouldn't fight, he'd humiliate them with a light beating for a few chuckles from his sycophantic friends. He often focused on the Inuit, especially Amruk, who was fiercer and more protective of his Inuit clan. Gordon had a deep hatred in him for the local tribes. a regular drunk, he didn't hide this hatred. Gordon decided to go for a late-night bladder relief. With no regard for the sleeping few around him, he grumbled and cursed while trying to find his way out of the tent and past the glowing embers of the bonfire that gave him some light, assisting the moon with little illumination to find his way beyond the tents to the edge of the meadow, near the tree line, in case he needed more than emptying the water. He stumbled, half filled with whiskey, towards the blackness of the tree line, keeping the small camp in his sights. He urinated across his own leg.
Ah, fuck!
Swore at himself, shook it and tucked himself back into his filthy dungarees. He then heard a woman's voice.
I'm here.
Beckoning him by name. He felt he must be still groggy and a bit drunk from sleep and was imagining it or a trick of the wind, but it persisted.
Can you see me?
It sounded beautiful and welcoming. It had been many months without a woman. The last time he was intimate with a woman, it was one-sided and immoral.
I can see you.
He smiled, zipped up and went peeking through the woods, urged on by the voice. He was in a dreamlike state. The woman's murmurs, the tones were heavenly, and he stumbled through the brush, half asleep, half drunk, tripping over roots and branches like an oaf.
Find me.
Stopping to lean on a tree and listen. He was grinding out his repulsive words, salivating down his chin with rivulets of chewing tobacco.
Come here, little lady. Come to me. I'll give you what you want.
He spattered in a rough, cheap, whiskey-worn voice.
I'm here.
He heard the feminine voice just behind the tree in front of him. He had no pure intentions towards this feminine voice. He felt wicked and continued to spew his raspy voice across the bush.
Stop playing games and get over here. I'll show you what I do to little ladies.
Then abruptly, the woman's song turned to a grotesque growl, and arms appeared to move from behind the tree, wrapping its long gray claws around the girth of the trunk, slowly revealing a massive head covered in antlers and long, deer-like snout, except with a face of rage, long fangs and red eyes. And without warning, as Gordon turned to run, it drove a long arm into his chest with a fleshy tearing. As it drew closer, and with his final breaths, he and it, the Tariaksuq, were inches away from each other's faces, and it panted a steamy breath out before it wrapped its claws around Gordon's neck, yanked him closer, and then the monster vacuumed out the essence from Gordon's near-dead body and dropped him silently to the forest floor as it walked over him, crushing his head with its foot as it proceeded to the camp. Behind the beast, more and more burning crimson eyes appeared, illuminating the pitch dark of the forest, and marched forward with the vengeful creature that dispatched Gordon. Sensing danger lurking closer and being less foolhardy, the natives of the camp ran silently from it while the loggers slept, taking one kayak and moving far down this place downstream towards anywhere but there. Deep into the wilderness, with no one to hear their screams, the loggers were set upon in the night and ravaged, dismembered, and torn apart one by one. None of the loggers escaped. When the Tariaksuq were finished their slaughter, they raised their heads and screeched into the night sky and slowly lumbered back into the forest, fading into the black of night, not to be seen again. Not until they are again called upon.